August 12, 1944, the sun had barely pierced the early morning haze over the European skies, casting pale gold streaks across the shattered landscape below, where towns smoldered from relentless bombardments and the earth itself seemed scarred by the fury of war. Amidst this chaos, in a small Allied airfield tucked away in Normandy, a young P-47 Thunderbolt fighter lay in ruin, its fuselage twisted and scorched, its wings scarred from enemy flak and the violent embrace of a near-fatal dogfight. To any ordinary crewman, it would have been nothing more than a heap of scrap, a victim of circumstances too cruel to recover. Yet for Corporal James "Jimmy" Callahan, a man whose nickname, Crazy, was earned not for recklessness, but for a fearless audacity that defied logic, that destroyed fighter was less an end than a beginning. He walked among the wreckage with a peculiar reverence, his eyes tracing every dent, every tear in the metal as if reading a map only he could decipher. The air was thick with the metallic scent of oil and gunpowder, mingled with the earthy tang of wet soil, and in that suffocating heat of early morning, an idea began to crystallize in his mind, one that would turn a broken machine into a legend of the skies. Jimmy's reputation had always preceded him. Pilots whispered stories of his uncanny ability to coax miracles from machines, deemed irreparable, of how he could stare at a mangled engine and, almost intuitively, understand its weaknesses and its hidden strengths. He had no formal engineering degree, only the raw instinctive understanding of mechanics that came from years of hands-on experience and an obsessive fascination with flight. But today, as he crouched beside the P-47's shattered nose, he felt something different, a connection, almost spiritual, with the machine. To him, it wasn't metal and wires. It was potential, a sleeping beast that needed only the right touch to awaken. With a small toolkit slung over his shoulder and a rag stuffed into his back pocket, Jimmy began his ritual. Every bolt he tightened, every panel he pried loose, was done with meticulous care, as if the aircraft itself were alive and demanding respect. Hours stretched into days, but time had no meaning in Jimmy's world. Only the pursuit of perfection and the thrill of defying expectation. By the second week of work, the crewmen around him had started to doubt whether this endeavor was sane. "Crazy's lost it this time," muttered Sergeant Hall, leaning against a supply crate, his eyes skeptical as Jimmy balanced precariously on the wing, welding a jagged tear in the aluminum skin. "That bird's a lost cause." But Jimmy only smiled, a faint glint of mischief in his eyes, as if the very doubt of others fueled his determination. He had become an almost mythical figure on the airfield, a man who spoke little, but whose actions resonated louder than any voice. Slowly the P-47 began to take shape under his relentless hands. Where once the fuselage was a twisted mess of metal, there now appeared lines of purpose and strength, reinforced yet elegant, practical yet daring. Every modification Jimmy made, the reinforced tail, the adjusted ailerons, the recalibrated engine, was born not from manuals or military protocol, but from intuition and imagination, a fusion of engineering and artistry that few could comprehend. By the third week, pilots had begun to take notice. Captain Reynolds, a grizzled veteran of countless sorties, approached cautiously, curiosity battling skepticism. "Callahan, what are you doing to her?" he asked, shading his eyes against the sun. Jimmy wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers blackened with grease and streaked with minor burns. "Making her fly again," he said simply, his tone devoid of arrogance but brimming with certainty. "Not just fly. I'm making her the kind of fighter that doesn't just survive dogfights. She dominates them." Reynolds studied the plane, the unusual, almost audacious modifications, and for a moment, the battlefield veteran could not deny the raw genius in front of him. Every detail, from the recalibrated engine compression to the customized cockpit layout, whispered a promise of something extraordinary. Yet it was Jimmy's most daring alteration, a radical adjustment to the P-47's weight distribution that would allow unprecedented maneuverability that drew the loudest whispers of disbelief. "He's mad," muttered another pilot. But deep down everyone knew that sometimes it was the mad ones who changed the course of history. The first test flight arrived like a storm, sudden and charged with tension. Jimmy himself, not a trained pilot, but a man whose familiarity with the P-47 bordered on symbiosis, insisted on taking the maiden voyage. Mechanics and pilots gathered, their eyes a mix of awe and fear, as he climbed into the cockpit canopy reflecting the early morning sun like a jewel. The engines roared to life, not with the hesitant tremor of a restored aircraft, but with a throaty, assertive growl that seemed to declare war on doubt itself. Jimmy taxied down the runway, the wheels gripping the tarmac as if defying gravity itself. And then, in a moment that would be remembered in whispered stories across squadrons, the P-47 lifted off the ground with a confidence that belied its battered past. Bank after bank, roll after roll, the plane responded with a precision that stunned onlookers. It was as though Jimmy had breathed not just life, but personality into the machine. A fighter with the soul of a warrior and the cunning of a seasoned ace. The airfield erupted into cheers, but Jimmy, sweat-streaked with grime, only allowed himself a small, satisfied grin, knowing that this was just the beginning. The true test would come in combat, where the sky itself became the crucible in which legends were forged. In the weeks that followed, tales of Jimmy and his resurrected P-47 began to circulate. Rumors spread through squadrons of a crazy crewman, whose aircraft seemed almost alive, whose maneuvers defied conventional aerodynamics, and whose presence in the skies brought both hope and terror. Enemy pilots spoke in hushed tones of a fighter that appeared out of nowhere, danced across the clouds with uncanny agility, and struck with unerring precision before vanishing like a phantom. The P-47, once condemned to scrap, had become a weapon of legend, its scars now badges of honor, its unconventional modifications a testament to human ingenuity and courage. But for Jimmy, recognition was never the goal. Every flight was a dialogue between man and machine, a delicate balance of risk and mastery, and every sortie carried the silent promise that even the most broken could rise to greatness if met with audacity, skill, and relentless belief. By the end of summer, the airfield itself seemed transformed. Where once there had been despair over the destruction left by relentless war, now there was hope, a quiet understanding that ingenuity and courage could reclaim even what seemed lost. And though Jimmy remained the same crazy crewman, dirt-streaked and tireless, those who witnessed his work knew they had glimpsed something extraordinary, a living testament to the fact that heroism was not solely measured in victories, medals, or ranks, but in the fearless defiance of odds, in the unwavering determination to transform despair into legend. The P-47, reborn under Jimmy's hands, was no longer merely a machine. It was a story of resilience, a story of daring, a story that would echo through the ages as the tale of a crazy man who saw possibility where others saw ruin, who carved destiny from destruction, and who, through sheer will and unmatched skill, turned a broken fighter into a legend that would forever soar above the clouds. The fall of 1944 brought a new intensity to the skies over Europe, a theater of war that demanded not only skill but cunning, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. Jimmy's P-47 had become more than a machine. It was a partner, a trusted comrade in the chaos of aerial combat. Word of the crazy crewman's fighter had spread, and soon he was called upon for missions that would test both his ingenuity and nerve. Each sortie presented its own set of dangers, flak that could shred the airframe in an instant, enemy fighters who were hungry for glory, and the ever-present threat of mechanical failure. Yet, as the engines roared and the wind tore past the canopy, Jimmy felt an exhilarating clarity that only true mastery could bring. He understood the plane's heartbeat, its temperaments, the subtle quirks that others would never notice. When he executed a sudden roll to evade enemy fire or a daring dive that no manual could have prepared him for, it was more than skill. It was instinct, a communion between man and metal that left even seasoned pilots awestruck. Every maneuver, every calculated risk, carried a profound lesson that victory was not only the result of firepower or training, but of vision, intuition, and the audacity to see opportunity where others saw doom. As the sun rose and set over war-torn landscapes, Jimmy and his reborn P-47 danced among clouds and chaos, each battle etching their legend deeper into the hearts of allies and foes alike. By mid-October, the skies were alive with stories of his daring, whispered among crews huddled around radios and mess halls, tales of impossible escapes, of a P-47 appearing from nowhere, striking with unerring precision, and vanishing before retaliation could arrive, created an aura that blurred the line between fact and myth. Some pilots insisted they had glimpsed the aircraft performing maneuvers that defied physics, banking impossibly tight or diving at speeds that would have shredded lesser planes. Jimmy, however, never let the legend inflate his ego. Each mission was approached with methodical focus, a deep awareness of the stakes, and an unwavering respect for the lives entrusted to him. both in the air and on the ground. While enemy flak shredded skies and chaos raged below, he maintained a single-minded resolve, understanding that the true measure of a fighter and its pilot was not in the number of enemies downed, but in the unwavering commitment to survive, protect, and prevail against impossible odds. His P-47, scarred but resilient, became a symbol of hope. A machine that had been written off yet now carried the audacity of a man unwilling to accept defeat. And in the quiet moments between sorties, when engines cooled and the adrenaline ebbed, Jimmy would walk among the wreckage of other planes and whisper to his own fighter, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared triumph over destruction, a bond forged in fire and reinforced in skyborne battles. The winter months brought a different kind of challenge. Snow and ice made airfields treacherous, and missions required meticulous planning to navigate the biting cold and frozen terrain. Yet even in these harsh conditions, Jimmy's P-47 performed flawlessly. Pilots who once scoffed at the crazy modifications now sought his guidance, eager to understand how a machine that should have been scrapped could outperform even the newest models. Jimmy, ever humble yet fiercely proud, shared insights selectively, knowing that the true magic was not merely in the metal but in the willingness to push beyond conventional limits. Each modification was a testament to creativity, vision, and the courage to defy expectations. On missions over the frigid European landscapes, he executed daring maneuvers that kept enemy pilots guessing, striking with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The P-47, once condemned, now carried the weight of legend, a fighter imbued with the essence of resilience, audacity, and brilliance. And Jimmy, the crazy crewman, became the living proof that determination could bend reality, that a broken machine could rise to become a symbol of hope and fear in equal measure. By spring of 1945, as the war edged toward its final chapters, the P-47 had not only survived countless missions, but had become a decisive factor in several key engagements. Stories of its agility, durability, and the uncanny prowess of its pilot spread through Allied command like wildfire. Jimmy's reputation evolved from that of a skilled mechanic to a figure of near mythical status, a man who had taken destruction and turned it into triumph, who had stared at wreckage and seen opportunity, who had, against every expectation, created a fighter capable of rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Pilots would recall decades later the fear in enemy eyes when a lone P-47, battered and unconventional, descended from the clouds like an avenging spirit, executing maneuvers that seemed impossible, striking with a lethality that belied its appearance. And yet for Jimmy, all of this was secondary. The real victory was the creation itself, a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the belief that nothing was ever truly lost. The P-47 was no longer merely a machine. It was a story of redemption, a narrative of audacity carved into aluminum and steel, an enduring symbol that greatness often arises from the most unexpected places. As the final weeks of the war unfolded, Jimmy's legend reached its zenith. The P-47, bearing the scars of countless battles and the unmistakable mark of its crazy creator, had become a beacon for those who refused to surrender to despair. Allied pilots, inspired by its presence, approached combat with renewed confidence, while enemy forces whispered tales of a phantom fighter that struck without warning and vanished without a trace. Yet Jimmy remained grounded, focused not on fame but on mastery, on the bond he shared with the machine that had transcended its broken beginnings. He had transformed destruction into legend, chaos into strategy, and doubt into inspiration. And in that transformation lay a profound truth. Heroism is not defined solely by valor or skill, but by the courage to see potential where others see ruin, to act when all else seems hopeless, and to persist with unwavering belief in the face of overwhelming odds. When the war finally drew to a close, the P-47 was retired from combat, but its legend endured. Museums and airfields would one day display the aircraft, preserving its battered yet majestic frame as a reminder of human ingenuity and indomitable spirit. Historians would recount the exploits of a crazy crewman whose vision and courage had turned a condemned machine into an instrument of triumph, a fighter whose story inspired generations of aviators and dreamers alike. And Jimmy, the man behind the legend, would fade into the annals of history, not as a hero seeking glory, but as a quiet craftsman who understood that true greatness lies not in recognition, but in the unwavering pursuit of possibility. He had taken wreckage and breathed life into it, had seen promise where others saw ruin, and in doing so, had reminded the world that even the most broken things, when met with courage, skill, and relentless determination, can rise to extraordinary heights. The P-47, reborn in the hands of a crazy crewman, would forever soar as a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the unyielding spirit that refuses to accept defeat. A story etched in metal, memory, and legend for generations to come. The months following, the war were quiet in comparison to the roar of engines and the whistle of enemy fire, yet for Jimmy, they were no less intense in their own way. He returned to the small airfield where he had first laid hands on the shattered P-47, now a place of memory more than war. The air smelled different, no longer scorched by flak or buzzing with the chaos of sorties, but sweet with spring blooms, the lingering tang of oil and metal still clinging faintly to the hangars as a reminder of what had been. Jimmy walked among the planes in storage, some restored, some waiting for their fate, and he often paused before the P-47 that had become legend. Time had treated it kindly, though the scratches, the burns, and the reinforced panels remained. A testament to battles survived and ingenuity applied. It was more than a plane. It was a chronicle of audacity and persistence, a story told in rivets and welded seams. Locals and historians would later marvel at the machine's design, unaware that its brilliance came not from engineers or military manuals, but from the intuition and daring of a man who refused to accept impossible. For Jimmy, each inspection was a quiet ritual, a conversation without words, a recognition that the past and present were entwined in metal, sweat, and belief. As the years unfolded, the legend of the crazy crewman grew far beyond the airfield or even Europe. Fellow veterans recounted his exploits with awe, embellishments creeping into every retelling, yet all rooted in truth. They spoke of impossible dives, of flak-torn skies, of dogfights where the odds were insurmountable yet somehow overcome. For some, Jimmy was a symbol of raw talent. For others, he was the embodiment of hope, proof that one individual's courage and vision could ripple through the chaos of war and leave a lasting mark. Yet despite the myth, Jimmy remained remarkably grounded. He rarely gave interviews or public speeches, preferring instead to teach younger mechanics and pilots, to share his knowledge not as a boast but as a gift, a way to empower those who would continue to defy limits in their own way. It was here, in the quiet mentorship of others, that he perhaps left his greatest legacy, the cultivation of skill, audacity, and vision in the next generation of aviators. They would never forget the man who had taken a ruined fighter and made it immortal, a living lesson in resilience, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of mastery. In small towns across Europe and America, stories circulated not only about Jimmy's heroics but about the P-47 itself, the plane that had seemed cursed yet flew with unparalleled skill. Children of veterans drew sketches of the aircraft in notebooks. Pilots memorized every maneuver and modification in their imaginations, and historians traced the lineage of post-war fighter designs to ideas first realized by one crazy crewman's hand. The P-47 became more than a historical artifact. It became a symbol, a representation of what can happen when imagination and determination are fused with skill. Museums displayed the aircraft, air shows celebrated it, and every display case or flight demonstration carried whispers of Jimmy's audacity. People would lean close, tracing the dents and scratches, and imagine the man who had dared to dream bigger than destruction, the man who had turned defeat into legend. Even decades later, pilots would describe the feeling of flying inspired by that P-47, as though they carried a fragment of its audacious spirit in the cockpit with them, a legacy that refused to die. Jimmy's own reflections in those years were tinged with both pride and humility. He understood that legends are fragile things, easily distorted, often exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood, yet they carry power precisely because of their endurance. He never sought fame, never desired recognition beyond the satisfaction of knowing that he had achieved something extraordinary. The P-47 had survived battles, storms, and skepticism, and in doing so, it had become proof that ingenuity and courage could defy expectations. Jimmy himself became a quiet observer of history, watching as the world moved on but leaving traces of inspiration in its wake. Letters arrived from aspiring pilots decades later, people who had read of the crazy crewman and his fighter and felt emboldened to pursue careers in aviation. engineering, or other fields where risk and creativity intertwined. Each letter was a reminder that heroism is not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it is a ripple that grows slowly, a quiet flame that ignites courage in distant hearts. Even in retirement, Jimmy remained a man of action, never content to sit idle. He tinkered in workshops, experimented with engines and flight designs, and revisited aircraft like old friends. Each plane a story, each modification a conversation. The world around him changed. New technologies emerged. Wars faded into history, yet his P-47 remained a constant, a symbol of what one individual could achieve with vision, skill, and relentless determination. Veterans who had flown alongside him would visit, eyes shining with the same awe they had felt decades earlier, and each reunion reinforced the quiet truth Jimmy had always known. Greatness is not defined solely by medals or recognition, but by the courage to act, to persist, and to transform the impossible into reality. The P-47, scarred yet majestic, sat in hangars, air shows, and museums, each panel a testament to battles won and imagination realized. And Jimmy, the man who had breathed life into its metal frame, remained a living legend, the embodiment of audacity, brilliance, and human resilience. In the end, history remembers heroes in many ways, through tales, medals, monuments, or faded photographs. But few stories are as enduring as those carved by ingenuity, courage, and unwavering vision. The Crazy Crewman and his P-47 became one of those rare stories, a narrative that transcended time, war, and even mortality itself. Generations would come to learn of a man who stared at destruction and saw potential, who refused to surrender to circumstance, and who, through unyielding determination, turned wreckage into a fighter legend that inspired awe, fear, and admiration across continents and decades. And perhaps the most profound truth of all is that in that story lies a lesson for every dreamer, every maker, every soul who dares to see possibility in the face of despair, that even in ruin, greatness can be forged, that courage can bend reality, and that the mark of true heroism is not just in what you accomplish, but in the fire you ignite in others long after your own battles have ended. Jimmy and his P-47 will forever soar in memory and imagination, a timeless testament to the extraordinary power of vision, determination, and audacity. Before Jimmy ever set foot on the airfield, before the roar of engines or the taste of flak in the sky, he had been a boy captivated by machines that could defy gravity. Born in a small industrial town in Pennsylvania, Jimmy's earliest memories were filled with the smell of oil, the clanging of hammers in his father's workshop, and the endless fascination of dismantling clocks, bicycles, and old engines just to understand how they worked. While other children spent hours playing games, Jimmy spent them sketching designs, imagining flight paths, and dreaming of wings that could carve the skies. By the age of 12, he had already built crude gliders from scrap wood and tin, launching them from the ridge behind his house and adjusting tail rudders or wing curvature with meticulous care. Each flight, whether successful or crash-landed in a field, was a lesson etched into muscle memory and imagination alike. Those formative years, quiet and solitary though they were, forged in him the kind of obsessive skill and intuitive understanding of mechanics that would later allow him to stare at a destroyed P-47 and see not scrap metal, but potential. The townspeople whispered of the boy who could fix anything, the one whose curiosity bordered on madness. But Jimmy paid little mind to whispers. He had learned early that genius often masquerades as folly, and that the audacity to see what others cannot is what separates the extraordinary from the ordinary. When the war arrived, Jimmy's path intersected with destiny in a way that seemed inevitable in hindsight. Drafted into the Army Air Forces, he quickly proved himself indispensable, not in the skies but on the ground, where planes arrived battered and broken from combat missions, sometimes appearing beyond repair. Officers often looked on in disbelief as Jimmy would kneel beside a fuselage, hands moving with a certainty that seemed almost supernatural, and in hours or sometimes days, transform the wreckage into a machine ready to soar once again. His moniker, Crazy, was whispered with a mix of derision and awe, for his ideas often defied standard protocols, welding reinforcements in unconventional spots, recalibrating engines for performance no manual prescribed, or altering aerodynamics in ways that seemed risky, reckless even. Yet time and again, his creations performed beyond expectations. The destroyed P-47 that would define his legend was simply the culmination of years of obsession, intuition, and audacious experimentation. A machine that had met its perfect match in the man who understood flight as both art and science. During combat, Jimmy's ingenuity was tested in ways that would have crushed lesser men. Enemy pilots were relentless, flak rained from the skies, and weather conditions could turn an ordinary mission into a nightmare. Yet his P-47 moved with an almost preternatural agility, responding as though anticipating Jimmy's thoughts. In one encounter over the Ardennes, outnumbered and surrounded by FW-190s, Jimmy executed a sequence of maneuvers that seemed impossible. Barrel rolls, sudden dives, tight vertical climbs that stretched the limits of both human reflex and aircraft integrity. Each movement exploited the unconventional modifications he had painstakingly applied: reinforced tail assemblies absorbing stress, recalibrated ailerons providing sharper response, and engine tuning that allowed a burst of power when gravity threatened to pull him down. Enemy pilots would later describe the event as surreal, a fighter twisting and darting through clouds like a living entity, appearing impossibly fast, untouchable, almost mocking in its precision. For Jimmy, it was instinct, honed over years of experimentation, observation, and the intimate understanding that comes from pouring one's life into the mechanics of a machine. What others called reckless, he called mastery, a balance of courage and calculation that defied convention, yet proved repeatedly that human ingenuity, when coupled with daring, can rewrite the rules of combat. But the war was not just machines and maneuvers. It was human drama, tension, and rivalry. Jimmy encountered other pilots who doubted his methods, men whose skepticism carried both challenge and hostility. Captain Vogel, a by-the-book ace with dozens of confirmed kills, initially dismissed Jimmy's P-47 as a folly, a patched-together aircraft unlikely to survive even a single sortie. Their first joint mission became the stuff of legend in whispered accounts. Vogel's sleek factory-standard fighter weaving alongside Jimmy's scarred and customized P-47, witnessing firsthand how the so-called crazy modifications allowed maneuvers no textbook could teach. By the end of the mission, Vogel had been converted from skeptic to admirer, recounting later that he had never seen an aircraft respond with such intuitive precision, nor a pilot command it with such fearless synergy. Rivalry, tension, and even doubt became catalysts for Jimmy's genius. Every question, every critique, every skeptical glance pushed him to refine his craft, to innovate further, to prove that possibility is often hidden beneath layers of disbelief. Winter missions added another layer of complexity, where frozen airfields and brittle metal threatened catastrophe at every turn. Engines needed meticulous preheating. Control surfaces required constant inspection, and even the slightest miscalculation could mean disaster in icy skies. Yet Jimmy's P-47 thrived under these conditions, a testament to foresight and engineering creativity. He installed heating elements in critical parts of the fuselage, modified fuel mixtures to prevent icing, and reinforced structural points that would otherwise fail under stress. Each innovation carried risk. Each solution demanded careful observation, yet the aircraft responded flawlessly. Fellow pilots began to treat the P-47 as almost invincible, a phantom that could confront weather, enemy fire, and extreme maneuvers without faltering. And Jimmy, ever humble, viewed it not as invincibility but as the fruit of meticulous attention, relentless experimentation, and the courage to imagine solutions others would never dare attempt. Through it all, Jimmy's story became inseparable from the story of the P-47. Together, they transformed battles into legend, despair into hope, and skepticism into awe. Veterans recounted tales of impossible escapes, daring attacks, and flights that seemed to defy physics, always highlighting not just the aircraft but the man whose vision made the impossible reality. The crazy crewman who began as a boy, fascinated by gears and gliders, had grown into a symbol of what courage, ingenuity, and relentless determination could achieve. And yet, even as legend grew, Jimmy remained quietly committed to the craft itself, a man for whom flight was less about recognition and more about mastery, about the communion between human mind and machine, about the audacity to turn even ruin into triumph. As spring gave way to summer in 1945, the war in Europe approached its final chaotic chapters, and Jimmy's P-47 continued to carve its legend across skies scarred by conflict. The aircraft, once condemned as scrap, now flew with a precision and grace that defied its battered exterior, each maneuver a symphony of engineering and instinct. On missions that tested every ounce of courage and skill, Jimmy faced situations that would have paralyzed ordinary pilots. Squadrons of enemy aircraft coordinating attacks in perfect formation, anti-aircraft flak raining from the heavens, and unpredictable weather that could twist a mission into catastrophe in moments. Yet in every instance, the P-47 responded as if alive, its controls an extension of Jimmy's own mind and reflexes. A sudden dive to evade a barrage, a spiraling climb to outmaneuver a pursuing fighter, a razor-sharp roll that left enemies bewildered. Each movement was a testament not just to his daring, but to countless hours of experimentation, observation, and meticulous modification. For Jimmy, there was no fear in these moments. Only a profound clarity. That mastery is born from preparation, courage, and the refusal to accept limits imposed by circumstance. And for those who witnessed him, the P-47 had become something more than a machine. It was an avatar of audacity, a living emblem of the human spirit at its peak. In one legendary engagement over the Rhine, Jimmy's skill and ingenuity were put to the ultimate test. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, his P-47 executed maneuvers that seemed impossible even by the most advanced aeronautical standards. Enemy fighters struggled to track the aircraft as it twisted, banked and dived in ways that defied their expectations, each movement exploiting subtle modifications Jimmy had painstakingly applied over months of trial and error. Observers would later recount the awe they felt watching the battle unfold. The P-47, scarred and unconventional, darted through clouds with uncanny precision, appearing almost as a phantom, striking with ruthless efficiency and disappearing before any retaliation could arrive. Jimmy's reputation, already legendary, became mythic. Stories of the crazy crewman and his indestructible fighter spread across squadrons and command posts, inspiring pilots, intimidating foes, and cementing a legacy that transcended individual battles. Yet for Jimmy, it was never about fame. The satisfaction came from mastery itself, the intimate dance between pilot and machine, and the quiet understanding that he had turned destruction into triumph through ingenuity, courage, and relentless determination. After the war, Jimmy's journey did not end. He returned to the United States, where the P-47, now retired from combat, became an icon of human resilience and creativity. Museums, airshows, and historians clamored to document its story, showcasing the fighter's scars not as blemishes but as badges of audacity, each dent and weld a testament to what one individual could accomplish when others had declared failure. Jimmy, however, remained humble, shunning accolades and fame, preferring instead to mentor aspiring pilots and engineers, sharing insights into mechanics, aerodynamics, and innovation. Letters arrived from young aviators across the country, inspired by the tale of the crazy crewman who had breathed life into a destroyed aircraft, and Jimmy responded with patience and generosity, understanding that the true legacy of his work lay not in medals or recognition, but in the spark of imagination and courage he ignited in others. Every student who learned to see beyond the obvious, to question limits, and to combine daring with skill carried forward a piece of Jimmy's philosophy, a quiet but enduring extension of his legend. Over time, the story of Jimmy and his P-47 grew into almost mythic proportions. Veterans spoke of him in reverent tones. Historians chronicled the technical brilliance and audacity behind the modifications, and aviation enthusiasts studied the aircraft to understand how a man could coax excellence from destruction. The P-47, once discarded and deemed irreparable, had become a symbol of possibility, a narrative that celebrated ingenuity, courage, and the refusal to accept defeat. Jimmy himself continued to tinker, to invent, and to inspire, embodying the very essence of what his aircraft had represented. That greatness is achieved not by following rules blindly, but by questioning them, by imagining beyond limitations, and by daring to act when others hesitate. Even decades later, pilots who had flown in the shadow of his legend described the feeling of the P-47's spirit guiding them, a reminder that human ingenuity, when coupled with courage, can transcend circumstances, defy expectations, and leave a mark that outlives wars, generations, and time itself. In the quiet moments of reflection, Jimmy would often gaze at the P-47, now preserved in a museum, and smile at the journey that had brought them both from destruction to immortality. Every dent, scratch, and welded seam told a story of courage, innovation, and audacity. Every maneuver once performed in the skies above. Europe carried lessons that extended far beyond combat. That failure is never final. That possibility often hides within despair. And that one individual's vision and determination can ripple outward to inspire countless others. The war eventually became history. The pilots aged and passed on. But the story of Jimmy and his crazy P-47 endured, a timeless reminder that greatness is born when skill meets courage, when imagination defies destruction, and when one man dares to see opportunity in ruin. And in that enduring legacy, the crazy crewman who had transformed a destroyed fighter into a legend would forever soar among the clouds, immortal not just in the metal of his aircraft, but in the hearts and minds of all who dared to dream beyond limits, to act beyond fear, and to believe that even from the ashes of destruction, legends can rise. Even after the war officially ended, the skies never truly lost their meaning for Jimmy. He felt the pulse of engines in his veins, the rhythm of propellers in his chest, and the endless potential of flight as a calling that extended beyond victory or defeat. In the post-war years, he took on new challenges, not on battlefields but in testing grounds and remote airfields, experimenting with aircraft designs and pushing the limits of aerodynamics in ways that military manuals had never considered. Engineers marveled at his insight, but Jimmy's genius was never confined to theory. He treated each machine as an extension of himself, calibrating engines by ear, adjusting wing angles with an almost tactile sense of balance, and envisioning maneuvers that would make even the most experienced pilots pause in disbelief. Friends and students who observed him at work described a quiet intensity, a man completely absorbed in a dialogue with metal and air, where mistakes were lessons and every breakthrough a small triumph. Over the ordinary, the very skills that had turned a destroyed P-47 into a legend were now applied to new machines, experimental aircraft, and prototypes that hinted at the future of aviation itself. Yet Jimmy's journey was not without personal cost. Nights were often sleepless, spent poring over blueprints, repairing engines, or reflecting on the lives lost and the chaos witnessed. He bore the quiet weight of survival, knowing that every day in the sky had carried risks not just to himself but to those who trusted him. Memories of flak-shredded skies, of comrades cut down in the flash of combat, haunted him, and he would sometimes pause in solitude, fingers tracing the worn rivets of the P-47, remembering faces and voices that would never return. And yet, within that reflection, was also profound gratitude, a recognition that courage and skill could preserve life as much as they destroyed, that careful innovation could tilt the balance between survival and tragedy. These quiet moments of introspection deepened his understanding of what it meant to be a hero, not to seek glory, but to embrace responsibility, to respect the fragile thread that separates life from oblivion, and to channel fear into focus, panic into precision. The legend of his P-47, meanwhile, continued to grow in almost mythic proportions. Veterans recounted tales of impossible dogfights and miraculous escapes, and the aircraft became a symbol of audacity and ingenuity that transcended national boundaries. Enemy pilots who had once engaged Jimmy in combat later spoke of him with a mixture of fear and admiration, acknowledging the uncanny precision and daring that defined every sortie. Even decades later, flight instructors would reference his maneuvers as case studies in mastery under pressure, his techniques inspiring generations of aviators to push the envelope of possibility while honoring the principles of discipline and careful observation. The P-47 itself, now displayed in museums and air shows, carried scars not as blemishes but as badges of triumph, teaching silent lessons about resilience, creativity, and the enduring power of human determination. Visitors would stand before the aircraft, tracing its panels with fingers or eyes, imagining the pilot who had coaxed greatness from what all others had, abandoned as hopeless scrap. And in every retelling, whether in textbooks, documentaries, or whispered stories among enthusiasts, Jimmy's audacity remained the centerpiece, a testament to what one mind, one will, and one relentless belief in possibility could accomplish. Beyond the accolades and historical reverence, Jimmy's influence seeped quietly into communities, inspiring those who may never touch a cockpit. Engineers, mechanics, and even young students found courage in his story, seeing reflected in his audacity a truth about life itself, that limitations are often self-imposed, that failure is temporary, and that relentless effort combined with vision can transform impossibility into achievement. Letters from aspiring pilots poured in over the decades, asking for guidance, sharing dreams, and recounting the impact Jimmy's P-47 had on their own ambitions. He answered with patience, empathy, and a quiet insistence on mastery, knowing that his legacy was not in medals or fame, but in the ripple effects of inspiration. And as he aged, he began to understand that perhaps the greatest flights were not those taken across skies at war, but those that took place in minds and hearts, where courage, creativity, and imagination soared unbound by fear, destruction, or doubt. Even in moments of reflection, Jimmy was drawn back to the P-47, now preserved in immaculate detail. Each panel and modification a story frozen in metal. He would walk around it in museums or hangars, hands brushing the worn edges, recalling the hours spent under harsh sun, in freezing wind, or amidst storms of flak, when intuition and audacity had been his only guides. The aircraft, battered yet unbroken, remained a living testament not only to the man's skill but to his philosophy, that greatness is forged in adversity, nurtured by imagination, and realized by those willing to act when others hesitate. And in that philosophy lay the enduring lesson for all who heard the tale, that even when the world deems something lost, broken or impossible, vision, determination, and courage can reclaim it, elevate it, and transform it into something legendary. Jimmy's P-47, once a wrecked relic, now soared eternally, not just in memory or metal, but in the spirit of every person daring enough to dream, to act, and to defy expectations. As years passed and the smoke of war faded into memory, Jimmy's mind often drifted back to the skies over Europe, to the adrenaline and terror of those desperate dogfights, and to the battered yet indomitable P-47 that had carried him through them all. He found that even in peacetime, the lessons of the skies remained vivid, the importance of observation, the necessity of calm under pressure, and the unspoken dialogue between man and machine that could decide life or death in seconds. With each retelling to younger pilots, each lecture in hangars and classrooms, he emphasized not just technique, but philosophy, that engineering is as much about imagination as precision, that fear is not a weakness but a guide, and that audacity, when paired with knowledge, can elevate the ordinary into the extraordinary. In these moments, he became less a war hero and more a teacher, a mentor who demonstrated that brilliance is cultivated not only through study but through experience, failure, and the unrelenting desire to push boundaries. Yet even in peace, the echoes of rivalry and competition lingered. Fellow veterans would challenge his methods, test his modifications, or debate the limits of his designs. Some tried to replicate the audacious maneuvers he had executed during the war, only to fail and marvel at the subtle genius hidden in every rivet, every recalibration, every calculated risk. Jimmy treated these challenges not as threats to his legacy, but as opportunities to demonstrate the depth of his understanding. He would explain in meticulous detail why the P-47's tail had been reinforced, why the ailerons had been recalibrated, and how minute adjustments to the engine's compression allowed it to respond with unprecedented agility. These explanations, often laced with anecdotes from harrowing combat experiences, transformed skeptics into admirers and solidified his status not merely as a crazy crewman, but as a pioneer in the art and science of aerial mastery. Through these interactions, the legend of the P-47 evolved, no longer a simple tale of wartime heroics, but a nuanced story of innovation, resilience, and the courage to think differently in moments where conventional wisdom demanded surrender. And yet, it was not only technical skill that defined Jimmy's post-war influence. Human connections, friendships forged in fire, and the shared trauma of battle shaped the man behind the legend. He maintained contact with pilots who had flown alongside him, mechanics who had assisted in daring repairs, and even former adversaries who had witnessed his unorthodox brilliance firsthand. In these relationships, he found a sense of closure and continuity, a recognition that history was built not only from acts of courage, but from the bonds forged in chaos. Stories of camaraderie emerged, of nights spent huddled around fires in enemy territory, of daring rescues, of laughter amidst terror. Each anecdote a reminder that even in the darkest skies, humanity persisted. Jimmy's personal history became intertwined with the P-47's, each informing the other, each deepening the legend in ways that mere numbers, medals, or statistics could never capture. In later years, the P-47 itself became a symbol far beyond the airfields and battle reports, representing the pinnacle of human ingenuity, courage, and the audacity to defy expectation. Jimmy traveled to air shows, museums, and schools, observing the wonder in the eyes of young enthusiasts and recognizing in them the same spark of curiosity and daring that had driven him as a boy in Pennsylvania. He would recount stories of flights through flak-laden skies, of impossible maneuvers executed with nothing but intuition and trust in the machine, and of the countless nights spent beneath the wings of the battered fighter, tweaking and perfecting it until it could perform feats that left even seasoned pilots awestruck. Every detail, from the recalibrated engine to the reinforced fuselage, was not merely technical but a narrative in itself, a story of perseverance, creativity, and the refusal to accept limits imposed by circumstance. In these retellings, the P-47 was more than a machine. It was a teacher, a companion, and a living testament to the extraordinary that can emerge from the ordinary. As decades passed, historians, engineers, and enthusiasts would dissect the story of Jimmy and his fighter, analyzing each modification, each audacious flight, and each improbable survival as though trying to extract a formula for genius. Yet the truth remained elusive. For the magic was never in manuals or measurements alone. It was in the combination of imagination, courage, relentless curiosity, and the sheer willingness to act when others hesitated. Jimmy embodied this principle, living proof that greatness is born not merely from circumstance, but from the conscious choice to challenge it. And even as time claimed his contemporaries, and new generations of aircraft eclipsed the designs of the past, the P-47 and its crazy crewman remained immortal, preserved in metal, memory, and legend. In the quiet of his later years, Jimmy often wandered the hangars, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the P-47, each scratch, dent, and welded seam a chronicle of battles survived, of limits challenged, and of a life dedicated to mastery. He reflected on the countless lessons learned in skies thick with flak, on nights filled with doubt and danger, and on the exhilaration of flight that had always carried him beyond fear. And in these reflections lay a profound truth. Heroism is not measured solely by medals or recognition, but by the courage to envision possibility where others see only ruin, by the determination to act when others hesitate, and by the persistence to create something extraordinary from the ordinary. Jimmy's story, intertwined with that of his P-47, endures as a timeless reminder that even in the face of destruction, audacity, ingenuity, and relentless spirit can forge legends, inspire generations, and elevate the human experience to heights beyond imagination. In the end, the crazy crewman who had transformed a destroyed fighter into a living legend soared forever, not only in history books or air shows, but in the hearts, minds, and dreams of all who dared to believe in the extraordinary. And so the story of Jimmy, the crazy crewman, and his legendary P-47 comes to rest not in medals or records, but in the enduring spirit of courage, ingenuity, and audacity. A man who saw possibility in destruction, who turned ruin into triumph, and who defied limits with nothing but skill, intuition, and relentless determination. Left behind more than a fighter, he left a legend, one that continues to soar in the hearts of dreamers, pilots, and anyone willing to believe that even the broken can rise, and that greatness often begins where others see only the impossible. Thanks for watching.